Thanks for joining us today. We are going to talk about the possibilities for generative AI and sourcing. And I'm here, Amy Fong. I'm a partner with Everest Group. I lead our programs focused on sourcing and vendor management stakeholders. Excited to have my colleague Vignesh here, as well as a friend, Edmund, and I'll let them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their roles. Edmund, you're the guest. You want to go first?
Thanks, Amy. It's great to be here and exciting to discuss the topic of generative AI and autonomous sourcing today with you two. So my name is Edmund Zagarin. I'm the founder and chief strategy officer of Orchestro. Orchestro is a predictive procurement orchestration platform that uses artificial intelligence, machine learning, but also game theory and behavioral science to help orchestrate complex procurement processes. And we are really focused on helping companies really instrument and execute their sourcing and buying and procurement activities using data, ideally using real-time data. My background is in strategic sourcing, and I actually kind of began working on this presentation in concert with a number of people on the ISM Thought Leadership Committee, and that's one of the reasons that I'm so excited about this topic and excited to share. Vignesh, do you want to give a little bit of your background and introduction?
Yeah, thanks, Edmund. Thanks, Amy. I'm super excited to be on this call and a very interesting topic to discuss. A quick introduction, I'm Vignesh Kannan, Vice President with the firm. I lead our research and advisory practice focused on procurement, supply chain, and finance and accounting. I've been with Everest Group for over 6 years now. So yeah, looking forward to this exciting discussion.
Thanks, guys. So excited to have two different perspectives here. These guys probably are way deeper in this than I am, but I think the evolution and the potential for generative AI in the sourcing space is really exciting and fascinating. So this format is really meant to be conversational, and we want to involve all of you in the audience as well. As a start, would love to hear where are the attendees, those joining on LinkedIn. Where are you all today? Where are you joining from? I know I'm in Dallas. Edmund is in San Francisco today, and Vignesh, you are in Bangalore, right?
Bangalore, yeah.
Okay, so we have a pretty global group here. So just add it to the chat. And as we go through, feel free to add your comments or your questions in the chat. And welcome, Susan from the UK. Great to see you. Amsterdam. Wow, these are all great places to visit too. I love the global audience, and happy to see you, Kate, from Dana Point. Another great location. Wow. So great to see that. Why don't we jump into it? So as a start, we're going to hit on a number of different topics today. The first thing I want to do is just define generative AI, and let's talk about what differentiates generative AI from other solutions. And I know Edmund has done this several times and has a pretty good viewpoint from this. So I'm going to ask him to go first and just give us, 5 minutes of how you view generative AI, and really why should we be talking about it today, and why should sourcing care about it?
Thanks, Amy, and always happy to share a perspective. I think a lot of us in procurement and supply chain and in sourcing, about 4 to 6 months ago, depending on where you are in the world, got hit by this question: what is ChatGPT? What is generative AI, and how is it going to affect our business? And those questions might have been coming from our executive teams. They might have been coming from our stakeholders. They might have been coming from people on our team who said, hey, I'm starting to use this technology. It's pretty exciting. And so I want to answer some basic questions. Why are we talking about this? How does the technology work? And what does it mean for our profession and for our industry? So first, this is just a little piece of data which is that this technology became the fastest technology to reach 1 million people. And this is a metric in technology disruption. You can see Netflix took 3.5 years, Twitter took 2 years, Spotify took 5 months, Instagram took 75 days, and ChatGPT accomplished that same reach in just 5 days. So really, really dramatic growth. And it's funny to look back on this because it was originally released really as a beta just for people to play with, and it just kind of caught fire and took over the conversation. And it didn't stop there. It went on to 1 billion pretty quickly thereafter, 1 million. And so the world is paying attention to this technology. There are lots of people that are using it on a daily basis to perform various tasks, ranging from searching the web to getting their basic questions answered. And so it is kind of this dramatic shock to the system. And the question is, well, what does this mean for procurement? What does this mean for sourcing, supply chain, and business operations? The Wall Street Journal did a deep dive on this, looking at some ways that generative AI through a chatbot interface could change supply chain. And one of the things that we do a lot in procurement is we ask questions of our data. We want to know how much we spent with a supplier, where an order is in the world, how long it's going to take to get there, and if there is a problem, what the status of it is, and what our team is doing to solve it. And these are all questions that potentially generative AI could give us faster and more accurate answers to. And I think that's something that you see in the journalism around this technology that people are just really excited about. One thing I did want to mention is from our Kestro customers, and one of the themes that have come up in our discussions with chief procurement officers and chief supply chain officers is that this technology is not just computer to computer from a kind of traditional application perspective. You're also seeing applications that uses an input signal technology that's being deployed at the loading dock. And so one example of this technology in production was instead of relying on a person to put in information from a manifest or bill of lading, there is now a sensor at a loading dock with a camera on it that will visually confirm that an order has arrived on time in full and record that metric, so a human does not have to enter it into a workstation, and then will actually use generative AI to make inferences and next steps from that ground truth input. What this means practically for us is that while a lot of times we've had to rely on imperfect data, unclean data, data that takes a lot of time to enter and takes even more time to confirm and check, we're now getting a kind of from the source data from sensors, from cameras that really can be game changing for our profession. Next slide, please. And this has dramatically impacted AI adoption among procurement and supply chain teams. As you can see from this recent research, there's only 6% of our cohort that is not considering this technology. Everyone else is on a journey where they're beginning to get educated, evaluate different solutions, stack rank their most impactful use cases, begin piloting and implementing technology in production with suppliers, whether it's managing communication, managing stakeholder intake, or managing real-time analysis of data that matters to them. Next slide, please. And so I want to talk a little bit about what makes generative AI different. And there are probably some people on the call, and I've now lived through 2 major hype cycles around AI in procurement. Some people might have lived through 4 or 5 of these. Everyone gets really excited about AI, and then 6 months or a year later, people are like, okay, well, what do we have to show for it? What are the business impacts? And so I'm very, very skeptical in general, but I'm going to make an argument that's cautiously optimistic about generative AI having reached an inflection point that has powered some of these seismic changes like you saw earlier, first to a million and first to a billion. And it really relates to how this technology works in two fundamental components. So transformers and reinforcement are kind of the fundamental building blocks. And one question that I always like to ask an AI vendor is, what is your reinforcement learning human feedback loop, your RLHF loop? And you can see to some extent that loop described in this diagram. You have an input, there's a transformer that turns words into zeros and ones, transforms them into inputs for statistical models, back into words, and then it shows an output. And then a human responds to that output. And based on the response, the machine says, did I do it right? Did I do a good job? And it learns and it learns again. This is based on a paper that was written by Google DeepMind researchers called Attention is All You Need, which essentially says using human attention, we can scale these reinforcement learning human feedback loops without limit across many different disciplines simultaneously. And that paper and research around transformers is really what's responsible for the AI renaissance that we're seeing today. Next slide, please. And shockingly enough, it comes from stuff like this. So on the right, we see chihuahuas and blueberry muffins, which is which. On the left, we see fried chicken and labradoodles. And so being able to answer basic questions and then have humans confirm that classification is a way of scaling classifiers, which is a kind of primary technology in AI research, in ways that haven't been possible before. And so, kind of the main application that generative AI got started on, and one reason it became so popular, is it just became the best way to make memes. And so, like, who doesn't want to make a meme? Like, people are using the technology for that. But in doing so, it also teaches the AI systems what people like and what people are interested in. Next slide, please. A little bit of vocabulary. I'm not going to dwell on this, but I just think it's useful for the viewers to have access to this. We're going to get into the conversation in just a sec, but I think having a little bit of background vocabulary is always useful. The main takeaway here is traditional AI required large amounts of data that was very clean and consistent in order to do basically anything. And the new generative AI models do not. And they don't because of the architecture of these transformers. And so you have an objective function. We want the machine to engage us. If it chats to us, we want it to chat back. There's a training set. It reinforces by how we respond to it. The model has weights and parameters. We can say we don't want certain types of responses. We do want other types of responses, longer versus shorter, faster versus longer tempo. Labels, then you have supervised learning, which is where we have to label the data. There's deep and unsupervised learning, and then there's efficiency, which is just really on the compute side, and then tuning, where we actually take it and perform domain-specific tasks. This is some of the most exciting growth, especially for the procurement side of the house, where very bespoke models could be tuned to specific categories of spend. Next slide, please. And this is coming, right? So Globality recently announced their chatbot called Glow, which purports to be as good as a coworker, which I think is a bold but also big if true claim. And I think it will be exciting to see how that technology evolves. And Tonkean has launched Procurement GPT, which is essentially the same technology applied to procurement. So this technology is already beginning to show up among many different solution providers, and I think it falls on us helping our teams and our stakeholders navigate the technology journey in procurement to understand what this technology is, how it works, and if there's leverage that we can gain. Next slide, please. And this is the last point that I'm going to make. It's a point that's been made by many people more eloquently than I. I'm not going to talk about existential risks right now or the propensity for AI to cause supply chain disruptions. If you're interested in either of those topics, connect with me on LinkedIn. There's some interesting work being done through a number of different association groups. But the final point I'll make is that this technology is, it sounds very confident, but it often says things that are not true. And so, again, going back to the architecture of reinforcement and transformers, which is the building blocks of ChatGPT and these other generative AI technologies, this technology makes stuff that it thinks will make us happy and will make us react in positive and excited ways. And it thus has the form of truth, but not the value of truth. There's a great article that I think called Stochastic Parrots that suggests AI is like a parrot. It's just trying to say stuff to get a reaction from us. Some people call it fancy autocomplete. If you've used autocomplete, but can imagine it completing like an entire page of text. But it also hallucinates. It says things that aren't true. It will make up news stories that haven't been written. And it will confabulate, which is something that Alzheimer's patients do, where if they make up something and you challenge them on it, they'll make up more stuff to support the things that you've challenged them on that also aren't true. So this is a little bit of a warning label on this technology as you embark on your journey. Just be aware that this can produce results that are not accurate.
All right, thanks, Edmund. I always love that fried chicken labradoodle one. Probably one of my favorite little AI comparisons, and it's not really new either. It's I've seen that floating around for many years now, but makes me hungry every time. So thanks. That's a great overview, and I think it kind of level sets a lot of people. I see there's a couple questions, and we are going to get to those. Actually, some of the questions you're asking in the audience are questions we do plan to cover, especially around confidentiality. Vignesh, I'm going to give you a chance to jump through an Everest Group definition and kind of our perspective on the evolution as well. Edmund's coming from one perspective. I think our perspective as a research firm focused on global services and technology, we have a bit different angle on the market, and so it's interesting to me to hear both of you talk through in your own words.
Yeah, thanks, Amy and Edmund. Great perspective. Before we get into Gen AI, probably let's take a look at the evolution of AI in itself, right? It's not Gen AI fundamentally. It's not a new concept, right? I would say it's a significant evolution of traditional AI models, right? If you look back. I'm sure most of you remember Windows 98. If I remember right, is that a paper clippy? Yeah, that's the basic form of AI tool, right? It started from there, and the sophistication evolved, right? And we got into different forms of AI in the form of, say, Siri, and a lot of chatbots came into the picture, and a lot of machine learning models came into the picture. But the last, I would say, 18 months or 2 years, there's been significant development in terms of the sophistication and the evolution of the AI models in itself, right? Looking at ChatGPT or the GPT model, GPT-3 and GPT-4, what makes this Gen AI very different from the traditional AI? It has been there, like your machine learning, deep learning, your NLP, NLGs, your GANs, transformer model, diffusion model. It has been there, right? The key here is what makes Gen AI so powerful is the volume of data and the number of parameters that go into the model, the sophistication of the AI model in itself, right? Just a comparison. GPT, if you take, there are 175 billion parameters that forms this model. And before GPT, the largest ML model was from Microsoft Turing with 17 billion parameters. So you can see that 10x jump in terms of the number of parameters that go into the model, right? And other couple of factors that makes this tool so sophisticated is, one, there has been a significant improvement, development in terms of computation power. So now we have systems that can process huge volume of data. And lastly, we have now data sets, right? And even GenAI is feeding into that in terms of creating your synthetic data to further train your model, right? So the quality of classified data sets and the sophistication of the ML model and the faster computation systems that we have is what is making GenAI and is what is making it very different from your traditional AI or ML models.
Thanks, Vignesh. So I want to jump now, and I think that's a good overview. And hopefully we all remember Clippy, or some of you may be too young to remember Clippy. I think both of you might be actually, but that was a pretty useless form of AI to many people. I think it's really fascinating how fast things have changed to the point that I think most people, we've got other webinars where we polled, and most people have used ChatGPT in some form or another, and it's been way more useful than Clippy was. So I want to turn now to how Gen AI is helping sourcing, or what the potential really is in the sourcing space. And when I think about this, I think of, when I look at the people I work with, right? CPOs, their teams, category managers, they kind of need to think about this in two ways. They're learning, they're educating in two ways. One is, what is the business and IT going to need to support us? So if I'm talking to an insurance company, they're going, what is generative AI going to do to insurance? What are my competitors doing? What do we need to start partnering or sourcing to support, our IT, our business functions, all of that. And that's super important for us all. If you're a category manager, you definitely should be thinking about this. We have a number of different Everest Group webinars on that. And so I'm not going to try to dive into that today because it's a huge topic that's evolving fast. But if you go through some of the blogs and the webinars on our site, we start to address, the broader scope of generative AI in the enterprise. For today, I want to focus on really the functional needs. So specifically, how is generative AI going to impact our own processes? So how we do work, who we work with, who we need to accomplish things, how we work with suppliers within the source to pay process, the procurement function. So Vignesh, if you could talk a little bit about this slide, and this is a framework I know we've used for a variety of different processes as we look at generative AI, just understanding which processes you are thinking right now are going to have the most opportunity.
Yeah. Before we get into that, I'll probably talk a little bit about the procurement ecosystem and how it is evolving, right? So traditionally, compared to other functions, say your contact center or your finance or HR function, procurement has been kind of behind in terms of adopting next generation technology. It has always been a cost centric function, but COVID changed a lot of things, right? There are a lot of organizations thinking of procurement being a value creation center and not just a cost center. So what COVID did was to accelerate the adoption of digital in the procurement function. So we have seen a significant adoption of multiple technologies, be it your S2P suite, or there are a lot of best of breed solutions coming into the mix, and specifically market intelligence kind of a category intelligence or a market intelligence solutions have picked up adoption. So in general, procurement is accelerating the adoption of digital, and COVID did that, right? Now the way I see Gen AI is COVID accelerated the adoption of digital, and Gen AI will accelerate the adoption of data and analytics, right? That's how I see Gen AI in the context of procurement. Now, if you look at from a procurement angle and the application or specific use cases or processes within the sourcing and procurement environment, there are couple of perspectives to look from. One, I strongly believe the entire buying experience is going to change if an organization is adopting Gen AI. And traditionally, if you look at some of the legacy systems in the procurement world, it has been designed in a process-centric mindset. It always has that process-centric architecture, right? Now with the advancement of technologies, with new platforms coming in, it is that the technology ecosystem and the architecture is moving from a process-centric view to a user-centric, persona-centric view, and Gen AI will accelerate that. So to take an example, if you take the entire buying process, right, Gen AI will act as an assistant in your buying process. And looking at in the context of your B2C buying experience, and procurement world is now adopting the concepts and technologies and process designs from the B2C buying experience. A lot of organizations have come to us, and we want to move to more like a Amazon buying experience, right? So I see this as unlike other technologies, Gen AI is more like evolved from a B2C kind of evolution, getting into an enterprise grade B2B solution. So I believe this will accelerate the adoption, and buying process will change significantly, right? It will act as a assistant to, say, for example, a buyer wants to order, say, 10 laptops, right? It can act as an assistant, give you prompts like, hey, if timeliness is very important, then go with these suppliers. These suppliers are, cost effective and are compliant with our contract policy. And if Gen AI is able to integrate with your catalog system, with your contract lifecycle management system, the power it can give and the assistant that it can give to buyer is immense, right? Now, of course, some of you have raised some questions around confidentiality, security. Yeah, those are still concerns that we need to address to realize the potential of this, right? So one, the buyer experience will change from a buyer angle. Second, if you look at from a supplier community, it's going to change the experience of the supplier itself, right? One common or high value quick win that I can see is help desk kind of a solution, right? Yeah, we have conversational AI, we have chatbots, but the data and the sophistication of the model that Gen AI is bringing in, the entire vendor query process will be almost touchless, right? So it will change the experience of the buyer, it will change the experience of the supplier, and lastly, it will make category managers, the entire procurement function intelligent, and frees up a lot of bandwidth to focus on higher order strategic work, right? The amount of data that the procurement function is sitting on, right? Your supplier data, your materials, you need category intelligence, you need supplier intelligence, right? The ability of Gen AI to derive insights and synthesize in a manner that is required for a procurement professional, that will save a lot of time and give a lot of value to this, right? And looking at, yeah, using this framework, we consider different factors, like what are the factors that will influence the adoption of this technology, what are the factors that will determine the potential of this technology, like the availability of data, what is the level of reasoning required for this particular process, and is that data sensitive, how critical is that information. So we looked at different factors, and this is again a preliminary view. We see a lot of use cases, one around the creation of document, right? Whether your purchase order creation, your RFX creation, or contract creation, right? So there it has a lot of potential. And from a sourcing angle, couple one we discussed around, say, the help desk kind of a use case. The other is more around bringing intelligence. You're reporting, say, if you have to roll out, identify a supplier for a particular requirement, it can analyze supplier, and in fact it can monitor the performance of the supplier, given the right data, right? So I would say it's still in early stages. Yes, there are a lot of concerns to be addressed, there are a lot of factors to be considered, sensitivity, all that, and the developments are happening. But I would say, like to echo Edmund's point, this looks solid compared to other technologies like blockchain, metaverse. There was a huge buzz and then dropped, right? But this shows some real potential there.
Yeah. Thanks, Vignesh. Yeah, and I look at this and I think about some of the other use cases that we're seeing contact centers, right? What can we learn from that? B2C support, how people can order. I know there was a headline about IKEA now using, AI for all of their contact center agents and retraining those people into being, designers, right? Which is a great example of shifting talent to a different skill set or reskilling. But when I think about how that applies into procurement, those are all things that we could be doing. And we've been talking about, like you said, the Amazon-like experience. Well, what that experience is in other contexts is it has evolved and will continue to evolve. Edmund, comments on that slide, or anything you would add in terms of, specific impacts and use cases? I see a lot of questions about use cases.
Yeah, well, I think just in terms of the questions to think through, one of the things that Vignesh mentioned that I think is really important is, you can ask generative AI to write a document for you, and it will produce a document that, I've seen it write things that are a better first draft than what I would have written, or what, especially someone with potentially less experience or newer to their role might produce. And so I think, that's really interesting, because getting a first draft of a RFP is a labor-intensive process. It's not entirely rewarding, and a lot of companies have these template libraries. A lot of people have worked in procurement for a long time, have like a bunch of templates on their computer. They have friends who they go, "Oh, hey, have you sourced this type of packaging before? Do you have some Excel sheet that you can hand over?" So that's something that generative AI, I think, is going to be very interesting to see how it impacts that. And then one of the things that came up when we were talking at the ISM committee was, how do we feel about our suppliers using this technology? And I think, Amy, to your point, this technology is in the contact center. It's in consumer applications. It's in a number of different areas. And I think it would be a mistake for us in working in procurement and sourcing and supply chain to think that this technology is not going to come to our suppliers. And it might even come to our suppliers before it comes to us. And so, that's a question I would put, to you. If you're advising an Everest client and someone says, should we have a policy or guidance to our suppliers on using ChatGPT to generate submissions to our RFPs, how do you feel about that? Does that feel like something, hey, no problem, like if they submit it, it's legally binding, doesn't matter who writes it? Or do you feel like that companies should have guidance with their suppliers?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I will say that in terms of writing things, I actually use ChatGPT to write the description for this LinkedIn Live. That is not my favorite task, and I've been trying to come up with tasks I don't love doing and how I can outsource them to the bots. And it did it pretty well. I just needed a couple prompts, and it wrote a very long agenda and description, and I sent it to marketing and said, "Go ahead, work with this. It's what ChatGPT says we should talk about to talk about ChatGPT." So, saved a little bit of headache for me. But yeah, I think it's a really good question. My take would be what you said around, if your suppliers are using ChatGPT to respond to an RFP, as long as what they're responding is binding, and they need to do, I think Anita made the point, it's great for a first draft. I would advise suppliers to use it as a first draft and then go through and review it. Anytime we submit an RFP response, we have 2 or 3 sets of eyes on it to make sure that everything's accurate. I think that's very important. But given that's, as long as suppliers are doing that and they're held to what they submit, I think it's fair game, right? RFP responses can be very tedious. No offense to our sourcing teams. I've been on both sides, right? They're very tedious, and frankly, sometimes it's a lot of the same questions in the same, in different formats. And I just did this yesterday. Here, we asked the same questions last week as these answers, right? And but reformat them into the right spreadsheet, right? And as we look at, one of the challenges I've seen from the supply side, or even from the buy side, in adopting tech and the e-sourcing side, everybody's using different platforms, and you have 7 different versions of the spreadsheet with the same questions asked different ways for every response. On the e-invoicing side, everybody's using a different form, or POs or whatever. Your supplier networks are all, I talked to a very large cloud company several years ago, and their AR person was like, or AP person, I guess, was like, I don't care. I'm not submitting to 17 different portals. And I'm like, well, if you're not going to automate your invoices, then no one is, right? So I think those challenges still kind of haunt us. And there are ways to get around that, right? And automate that process and make it easier for both the customer, the buyer, and the supplier in this. So I don't have a moral issue with that, although we all are responsible for accuracy, and that's where things can go wrong, right? Vignesh, any other thoughts on that, or Edmund, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I saw some comments around data quality, data security, right? And especially procurement interacts with suppliers, and the data from the companies going out. And recently, I think a month back, a very confidential information from a phone manufacturer went out, right? And someone in the company used ChatGPT to redraft something, right? So there are, it can have critical damage, reputation-wise, financial risk, IP risk, yes. But the key to accelerate the adoption and realize the potential is how can you guard the data that a Gen AI can access, and how you can utilize this data. And I know a lot of big techs and service providers in the procurement world are working with big techs and platforms to build security, compliance around this. But that is, to me, going to be how the data is going to be managed when Gen AI is integrated with the procurement systems will determine the adoption rate.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of questions on confidentiality, and I want to dig into that in a minute. I do want to talk about what it means for suppliers, and I think one thing that I just heard earlier today in a leadership meeting, we work with a lot of service providers as well on the outsourced services side, and some of my colleagues pointed out that there are service providers that are hearing from their clients that they're not allowed to use generative AI. And I think that goes back to Edmund's point. I think that's really interesting, both from an internal perspective of companies saying you can't, teams don't use it, and from a supplier perspective of saying we don't want you using it at all. And certainly the risk part is a good reason, but I think that that's something that we probably need to rethink, because when you think about it from from IT, from a coding perspective, contact centers, all of these different areas of the business, there are huge opportunities to do work that's really not easy for people to do, and it's much more efficient. So I think that's an interesting path there to go down. But Vignesh, I know you work with a lot of the service providers on the outsourced procurement side. Can you talk a little bit about this slide and what some of the big providers are doing in this space, and also how we can use procurement outsourcing providers to learn more, to adopt more? What are you seeing?
Yeah. So the last 6 months, or I would say 3-4 months, most of the leading outsourcing providers have started investing significantly in bringing Gen AI to business process services in general, right? And on the slide you can see some examples here, but a couple of areas where they are making investments is one. These large leading service providers are setting up a dedicated Gen AI COE and exploring different use cases, right, across different functions, different industries. So identifying the use cases where GenAI can play a role, where it can have a meaningful potential. So we have seen a lot of leading providers. Accenture is one example, and EXL has also set up a COE. IBM has set up a COE with dedicated 1,500 people who are purely focused on exploring use cases and how can they bring Gen AI to the table. The other type of investments or progress that we have seen is very strategic partnership with big tech, right? How can they bring in Gen AI to their platform, to their ecosystem? So we are seeing a lot of strategic collaboration, partnership, and a lot of this procurement outsourcing providers are actively working with big techs to address two key concerns, right? The security and confidentiality data confidentiality. Other kind of investments that I've seen is, most of these leading providers have good AI capabilities, right? For example, Cognizant has Neuro platform. Now they are embedding Gen AI into their Neuro platform, right? Similarly, TCS have Ignio as their AI platform. Wipro has Holmes as their Ego, platform. And IBM, I'm sure you all heard of Watson. Now they have launched Watson X, where they have integrated Gen AI capabilities, LLM models into their platform. So in short period of time, in and around 6 months or so, a lot of these providers have showed that agility in investing and exploring Gen AI. Whether if you're asking, are there any real implementation use cases? Yes, to some extent, most are in pilot stages. But compared to broader enterprise side of the picture, we are seeing on the supplier side, the service provider side, the extent of investment is massive in the last 5 to 6 months. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, it's really been a huge investment, fairly quick. Some things have been around for a while, like Watson, but really shifting track on a lot of this as the technology is caught up. Edmund, anything that we missed here in terms of, and then I'd love to hear from your perspective, what sourcing should be asking their suppliers for around generative AI?
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time to be doing this work and to be thinking about these questions. And I think that the best that procurement and sourcing teams can do in questioning not just their suppliers from a service provider, materials, and so on side, but questioning from a technology side and saying, hey, we want to know what LLMs you're using. If you have plans to adopt this technology, what are some of the friction points that we have in using your technology, and how are you applying LLMs or generative AI to reduce some of those friction points? And I think one of the things that's really interesting is that, to Vignesh's point earlier about like the help center being a real quick win, like how much do we spend on user adoption and training for new procurement systems? Like anyone who's gone through a source to pay transformation knows that like the change management and just user adoption journey can be a pain. And so like this has the potential to radically impact user adoption of existing source to pay technology. To me, that seems like the quick wins here are not going to be in like radically rethinking our procurement process. It's going to be in getting additional leverage off of technologies we're already using. That's one reason that Orchestra overall is betting big on embedded systems. We don't think that companies are going to rip out systems they've spent decades in some cases really fighting to get into their enterprise. It's more, how can we use emerging technologies to use what we have better, get more ROI from some of our existing technology investments. So that's one of the themes that we've been hearing. And I want to there's a comment from Anita Weiss that I think is really powerful, and I just want to kind of elevate that for the group discussion, which is and this actually echoes something that Satya Nadella of Microsoft has said, which is like, think about how each role can get leverage for higher value activities. And it's so funny because one of the earliest professions that was like meaningfully impacted by this technology is software programming. And like, if you're an AI programmer, like your job has changed. Like, and it's changed not just because the technology is different in terms of what we work on, but because it's like pretty easy for AI to generate code. So like literally write code. And so the last thing I would say, Amy, to your question of like, how can procurement use generative AI now for a business case, and like what questions would you ask your suppliers? I would challenge everyone on this call who has a relationship with an IT services provider to ask how generative AI is going to reduce your bill in the next few years, because there's no reason it shouldn't. And I think it's very reasonable as you see Infosys making this investment, some of the Accenture, of course, some of these other groups. If there's a provider that's doing outsource IT service work, or providing integration support, generative AI should be part of their value proposition, or at very least, tasks that once took a certain number of hours should take dramatically less. And I think that should begin to show up in statements of work and even in commercial proposals.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what you're jumping in there is a lot of what our pricing assurance team is doing right now, which is, one observation is that we have right now in the market is that a lot of people are moving to a managed services construct instead of a T&E construct or T&M. There's a lot of reasons for that, and it does tend to be more efficient when you give a little bit more control to the provider. And in a market like this, that's a good way to shift things around. But I think that's another outcome there, that it gives providers more flexibility in how they deploy these new technologies, to save costs, to be more efficient, to shift to more strategic activities, shift their resources around, fill in gaps in talent that we've been dealing with for the last couple of years. So it's a really good point. If you want to understand that a little bit more, we have analysts who can go very deep into what the pricing models should be like. So before we go a lot further, I feel like we need to go into the elephant in the room, which everybody's been kind of calling out: the challenges, the limitations, the risks of generative AI. And this is a huge issue, especially from sourcing, where we deal with a lot of kind of private proprietary information, confidential information that we don't want getting out on the internet to our competitors. We may not even want it getting out internally, right? A lot of the projects that we see, the sourcing projects, are, going to affect people's jobs. And the non-private nature of ChatGPT has a lot of people worried. There's obviously also concerns around accuracy and response. There's a lot of concerns about ethics, and Edmund, I know you're particularly close to the ethical topic. But before we get into any specific, are these reasonable concerns? And I'd like to hear from you how you see, especially the privacy and confidentiality point, being addressed over time.
Yeah, I think it's a huge point. I mean, Vignesh raised this earlier with a certain phone company having secrets kind of get out into the wild. You can, if you're on this LinkedIn Live, you can Google that to check out some of the stories around that. But it is a real risk, and I think that especially in procurement, I mean, I feel like the non-disclosure agreement is really a very very standard part of so many interactions that we work on. And so to have a disparate group of employees with access to central systems that also have access to this to generative AI systems that could potentially circulate that confidential information outside of our four walls or outside of our trusted networks is, I think it's scary for a lot of people. One of the things that just anecdotally I can share is that a bunch of companies have gone out and banned this technology outright and said, we don't want our employees using this. Well, I would say, like, imagine if a company banned using Amazon at work. Like, all the employees might still use it when they go home. And like, people generally have their phones with them. And so I just think, like, it may be a little bit unrealistic to say that outright bans are going to be completely effective as a solution long term. I think that companies have done them reactively a little bit to say, hey, let's just like have a policy that says we don't want anyone using this for anything. I think one thing that we'll begin to see is, I think we'll have, can you confirm that this response, that you did not put our RFP into ChatGPT as an RFP question? I think that will be like an interesting one. In addition to, I think it will also change non-disclosure agreements. I think legal departments are already beginning to update those to say, hey, by the way, like, disclosure means, like, did you put information in our conversation or in our documents into an LLM or into a generative AI system? If you think about that, that's really new because, like, if you take something from an RFP and you do a Google search on it, you're not disclosing it. Like, that is within the bounds of what non-disclosure typically means. However, generative AI works differently. That information can travel. And so that's something that I think people are just beginning to kind of understand, of how public is this information. And I think, one thing I would be really curious about, Vignesh, or Amy, if you have a comment on this, is, some of the questions in the chat, it seem to suggest that, I see one: almost zero privacy and security from Arnab Chowdhury. No wonder enterprises or blocking access. It should come with a warning label, statutory warning, use at your own risk. And so I wonder, what kind of warning label do you think people that are implementing this technology should have to their employees, stakeholders, or if this technology is being used with suppliers, should suppliers have, essentially have to agree to some of the risks up front in order to even use this technology? And just to make it even more complicated, do you think bans work? Are you pro-ban? Are you anti-ban? Where do you
Vignesh, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah. So to your last question, I don't think bans work. Like, to your point, I was talking to one of our clients a couple of days back. She was saying that it's banned, but I'm just going to use my phone. So I've seen those cases. I don't think bans are going to work, and that shouldn't be the way an organization should be taking this to their employees. To me, for, like, you mentioned about change management, right? That's critical here. It is very important to educate how to use this, right? Educate the risks and concerns, right? Rather than putting, hey, don't use it. Right? So here are the risks, here are the potentials, here are the cases that you can use, right? So that educational and mindset shift is very important than setting some controls or putting a ban from a system standpoint. So to me, mindset change is more important than placing some controls in the system. And secondly, we're hearing exploring, let's control the access to the data. Let's only let Gen AI access data in our private cloud, right? Let's limit the use cases. Let's limit the access of Gen AI to particular data, right? That's counterintuitive to me, right? Once you limit it, then you're basically suppressing the potential of Gen AI. So I would say I don't have a clear answer, but the way investments are happening, and the kind of exploration and pilots that we are seeing, I believe soon, as an industry, we'll figure out how to manage this confidentiality data. But putting in security. I think the big techs, hyperscalers will have a huge role to play here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we all tend to go to ChatGPT, which is sort of a public platform, and we'll see more of, you know, what I would, you know, years ago have referred to as a walled garden in the early days of the internet. But you know, there are so many applications where you can have your own internal to your company ChatGPT, or sorry, not Chat, but generative AI solution that's, you know, just gathering internal processes from a supply chain perspective, or all of the sort of judgment related things that we're doing on a regular basis, aggregating that information, that sort of tribal knowledge, as we've often called it. There's a huge potential there to do that internal to a company as well, and you're not facing those risks. Edmund, I laugh a little bit when you talk about Amazon, because there was a point, and there still is, where a lot of companies say, if you want to buy anything, you have to go through our ERP or through our, I'm not going to name names, but, you know, whatever P2P platform for requisitioning. And how well did that go, right? I've seen all the rogue spend data out there, and very few companies can get above 70 or 80% of their spend through the contracted processes. So it didn't work. People still went to Amazon and bought what they wanted, or called their friend down the street or whatever. And it's not going to work here either. That's just not how, very few companies now are in a command and control nature that's going to work that way. So I do think we need to figure this out. I want to put a plug in that we do have a paper that you can download here, a generative AI viewpoint, the new age of artificial intelligence, and the link for that is in the comments or in the chat. So feel free to go click that. It's a pretty interesting paper, and it goes, you know, goes through this from a broader perspective, kind of that, how do we help our organizations view for sourcing. So I still see a lot of questions. We don't have a hard stop on this, but I do want to ask, you know, let's wrap up, or start to wrap up, got a couple minutes, with kind of just a general question in terms of how much of this is the current hype, is kind of buzz, and it's going to settle out. It's going to be, you know, people say metaverse is dead. I'm not convinced it's dead. I still think there's a lot of applications, but the B2C part maybe is not as exciting as it might have been made out to be. But how much of it is real and will gain traction? And I think that there's a question here on the pros and cons, and I think that kind of aligns with that. Like, are the pros big enough that this is going to be something that sticks? Who wants to go first on that?
Yeah, I'll share my perspective. I think to that question, definitely, you know, pros outweigh cons. In terms of whether this is a buzzword going to settle, I think, yeah, Edmund mentioned earlier, right? We are in the hype cycle. It will settle down, but it will not drop off. I don't see GenA as, you know, altogether a different technology that's going to change the procurement landscape. Again, echoing Edmund's point. I see GenA as a value amplification layer, right? Which will amplify the value of the investments that you have made. If you have invested in analytics solution, it's going to amplify the value of that. If you have invested in an automation platform, it's going to amplify the value of that. So it's not going to fundamentally change your process, change your ecosystem. It's a value amplification technology. So it's going to have impact.
Edmund.
Yeah, I would agree with Vignesh. It's funny. Our orchestra's like, our company mission is to amplify the value of procurement.
Sort of a wrong person to ask, right?
Funny word choice. But yeah, no, I agree. I think you know, procurement's been on a digital transformation for a while now, with, I think, some fits and starts and varying degrees of success. The only way that you could have been wrong consistently for the past 20 years would have been to, like, bet against digital and in favor of, like, we're going to keep doing it on paper. And it took much longer than a lot of people thought. But if you look at source to pay adoption where it is now, you know, like, most companies are very comfortable doing business electronically, doing business online. In certain industries, there's still opportunity. But I think that, you know, to Vignesh's opening point about Clippy in you know, Windows 98, like this, like, like, what's old is new again. Like, this technology has already been around. It's already been transforming the way that we work for a while. And I think the question, like, in my mind, I kind of have three questions that I would leave as like open think abouts for people who have been marinating and digesting on some of the information here. One is, does generative AI, like, if you have a coworker that you've never met and like you interact with them over Zoom and you email with them, and like you send them information and they analyze it and they send you answers back, like, could generative AI essentially perform some version of that for you and be more like responsive and consistently available than certain, not all, but certain coworkers that you've had like the experience of working with? And so, like, it's a little bit of a provocative statement, but I ask that because I don't know what the answer is. I don't think anyone does. And I don't think anyone, even the people working on generative AI, fully understand exactly how or why these models work, or what causes them to mature. We have some sense that like the number of parameters is important. Like, yes, a trillion parameters is like better than a billion. Great. And like, more loops, more like reinforcement learning, human feedback loops is good. Like, so if we have an order of magnitude more, the model will be better. Generally, people are confident in that. But the inflection points and breakthroughs are very nonlinear. And so I think, if that happens, it will happen for different people in different areas, in different industries, at different times, in different geographies, and so on. I don't expect it to be like a massive, everyone adopts it all at once kind of wave. But I asked that question, like, would you have an AI coworker? I don't know. I think that really depends more on emotional comfort and culture than it does on the technology. The second question is, can AI help me do something sooner than I would otherwise? And I say sooner because I think we often get it focused on efficiency and effectiveness, and to an extent, speed is part of both. But I think for procurement and supply chain, getting involved earlier is so valuable. And so if there's something where generative AI could be a warning system for something that we would otherwise have to monitor manually or find out through data analysis, I think that could potentially be disruptive for procurement. And so I think, like, different industries will look at this different ways. We have some customers in the automotive space who really care about the availability of certain components. It could be easy to set up a very simple monitoring system for those components that could be very custom built for that need. Chemical industry, same deal. And then the third question I would ask, and this, again, these are just questions to think about and takeaways, hopefully useful. Just kind of think about is there like a task that's really unpleasant that you have to do all the time, like you have to pay someone to do all the time, that involves document creation? And if there is, then like, could AI begin to do that? Because like the number one job that we're seeing get disrupted in this space is copywriting, which is so strange. Like, if you ask people 10 years ago what jobs are going to be replaced or disrupted by AI, I think a lot of people would have said, oh, like things that are very rules based, like accounting or, kind of purchasing was on the list. But like, it turns out AI is really good at writing poetry and making memes and like doing weird art. And so like, that was not something that people 10 years ago really foresaw as being like an application, because those are all really creativity involved practices. So I like, if you're paying someone to create copy, it's part of your function, like that's something to look at. And I think there's John Oliver did a great segment on AI where they interviewed lots of different industries and they talked about AI in legal. And one of the things, there was a comment from that episode, which is, I don't think AI will replace lawyers, but I think lawyers who use AI will replace lawyers who don't. And I think that that's a really valuable frame. Like, I don't think we should be like afraid that AI is going to like take our jobs, but I do think that there's so much leverage and time savings there that I think that procurement teams and procurement organizations, and of course, outsourced service providers that leverage this technology will have a compelling value proposition and potentially be able to get more market share.
Yeah, I think those are all really good questions to think about. I have heard the advice given, if someone's coming out of college now, will they have a job because of AI? And then the answer was, well, they need to learn the right prompts to use AI to do their job better, right? So it's not them against the AI, it's like, how do you use it better? And I think the concept of, think of the task that you most hate doing, and see how you can use that. That kind of goes back to my writing descriptions for webinars and LinkedIn Live things. Hate doing that. It's not that hard, just always the last thing on the list. But there's a lot of other things. Cleaning my house, I agree, Susan. I've got 2 robotic vacuums now that do that. So that's a huge win for me. But so I'm going to wrap up. Any final comments from either of you before we close out today?
Thanks for a great discussion. Yeah, this is very great to see what Everest's perspective on the topic is, and just lovely to chat with both of you.
Yeah, again, echo that great discussion, and thank all the participants. Very engaging comments and discussions. I thoroughly enjoyed this. Probably if you do this maybe 6 months from now, a refresh of this, things might be very different.
Yeah, it's fascinating because 6 months ago we wouldn't have been talking about this, and I'd love to hear where we are in 6 months. I want to thank everyone who attended. We had really good participation, great comments. I think there's, this could go on for 3 hours. Questions about costs, questions more about, the ethics, accuracy, all of that. Obviously, there's no end to the conversation. I want to encourage you all. You can reach out to any of us. You got here through LinkedIn, so you have our contact information that way. Also through the Everest Group site or the Orchestro site. I see there's a question for Orchestro, and I'll let Edmund take that offline. But thank you, everyone. Appreciate the participation, and look forward to continuing this conversation in the future. And thanks, Edmund and Vignesh, for giving us your time.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Edmund.
Thanks so much, Amy.
Have a great day.
Thanks
a lot. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys.